Alright everyone, welcome back. Today I will be just recording the audio version of the lecture, primarily because it uploads faster, and I would like to get this lecture uploaded quickly, and then I'll show up again on Thursday for that lecture. So I did want to go over the syllabus quickly and just kind of touch base where we're at. So we're here in week 3 where we need to finish up still a little bit on research methods, and then we'll start talking about culture and society. And if you've been looking ahead, you know that next week you have your first exam on Thursday. So how the exams work in this class, basically you've got 3 of them, usually 40 to 50 questions, multiple choice. They primarily focus on definitions that we discuss in lecture and in both of the books. But again, some of the exams actually cover the lecture material a bit more than the books. But anyway, so 1 week before the exam, so this coming Thursday, I will post a study guide with most of the terms, if not actually all the terms that you'll want to know for the exam. Not every definition or term is going to be on the exam, but everything that's on the exam will be in the study guide. I have office hours next Monday through Zoom, so if you want to meet with me, just contact me then. The exam will cover the first few lectures, basically up to next Tuesday when we start talking about the environment. And it will focus on the first couple of chapters of Connected and the Neo-Feudalism book. So anyway, and just in case you were wondering, let's see here, the modules, if you go there, that's where you kind of see where everything is. So I'll, for example, I've got a number, the Christakis video is there, along with a bunch of little short videos on some of the theorists we discussed. And I'll be opening the module for this week later today. Okay, now that business is out of the way, moving on, I did want to just kind of mention a few things about the books before we talk about the research process. So you hopefully have received The Coming Neo-Feudalism and have started reading it. I think it's a good book because Joel Kotkin, I think he has a view of what's happening in society, and he's making an argument that I find compelling. So in medieval times, the medieval worldview, basically societies were held together through mutual obligation. There was less individualism, essentially. In the 1800s, some of this begins to change. You also get people talking about capitalist feudalism or feudal socialism. All of these basic things, in the 1800s, as we discussed last time, they're trying to figure out how to balance modernity, but also restore some of the social hierarchies and these notions of aristocracy. And then out of this comes what we call classical liberalism, which would not necessarily be, liberal as we think of it in the United States, MSNBC, that sort of thing, but rather liberalism referring to representative democracy, free markets, an open press, that sort of thing. And Kotkin kind of makes the argument that Russia, for example, never really had a period of liberal capitalism. And, essentially you've seen a sort of neo-feudal system develop in Russia, where it's not necessarily hereditary. Sorry, I've got a cat here. She'll make an appearance later on video. You just get to hear the soundtrack version now. But anyway, so the kind of new feudalists in Russia are not necessarily, the hereditary aristocrats of previous times. Hold on. And there are some people, I think, as we've talked about, or maybe I mentioned, who want to bring back feudalism, both in terms of Europe and in Japan, the samurai, for example. And interestingly, a number of there are a surprising number of people in the United States who want to have a feudal system, which is kind of interesting because out of all of these places, America is the one place that's never had a feudal system. So anyway, I did want to just briefly go over that and kind of what Kotkin's arguing there. Now, moving on into connected, again, it sounds like based on some of the discussions on PackBack that a lot of you understand, what's the social network stuff, but, I want to go over it just to make sure that we're all on the same page. Again, these are both, different editions. The only thing that's really, I think, different is like the introduction and a few things. So if you can get either copy. So I wanted to kind of go over chapter 2, I guess, where, they discuss this laughing epidemic. And this is something that we call a mass psychogenic illness, where a number of people are affected and, it kind of spreads through the group. So in this example, they talked about this hysteria where, they started with 3 teenage girls and they, just were laughing, and this laughing spread throughout the village, the neighboring villages, and you had to have a number of schools closed. And, there was a number, hundreds of scientists were dispatched down there in Tanzania, and were doing all sorts of DNA testing and blood testing and all of these things. And basically the best explanation is that this is one of these psychogenic illnesses. One example, that's actually not at all amusing or laughing, but is I think instructive, comes out of Germany during the Second World War. As the Soviets were invading Germany, a lot of people aren't aware of this, but around 200,000 women in East Germany were raped by Soviet soldiers. And there was an instance where, I forgot, where there was some guy, a German person who was sitting in his village and was journaling or something. And the Soviets had attacked nearby, and a number of women in this neighboring village were raped. And so he was sitting on this hill, and he just watched this line, this almost never-ending line of women that were walking, and then they would all basically turn and walk into a river and drown. So there's this mass suicide that this person witnessed. But it was, kind of a very dark example of where this mass psychogenic illness can go. Now, what's kind of interesting, we talked about emotional contagion, and we find this in networks that have high transitivity. So remember, that's, they can move back and forth very easily. Find that it happens more when people are face to face. This is why you see a lot of mob behavior play out the way that it does. Interestingly, and I'm not quite sure why this is. There's just some theories at this point, but women are more affected by these mass psychogenic illnesses, epidemics more often than men. The reasons right now, that people are thinking of are that women are more inclined to discuss some of the symptoms they may be experiencing. Generally a better sense of smell, and this might seem kind of weird to you, like what does that have to do with emotional contagion? Well, interestingly enough, that in the same part of the brain, the orbitofrontal cortex, regulates both smell and emotion. So there's actually a strong case in neurobiology that, one of the reasons that women are more, generally speaking, again, women are more empathic than men is related to this, this difference in the brain. We also know that generally emotions spread through family members and people who are, close friends and associates, rather than through maybe a group of strangers. So they did an experiment where people had these beepers and they were recording, basically the emotional states of these different family members and how they would change. And they were kind of wondering, okay, how do emotions spread within a family? So interestingly, I'll kind of start from this bottom line and go up, but fathers had the most significant effect on wives and sons. So, in this research, a father would be coming home from work and, maybe they're in a bad mood and, they take it out on, or they're just grumpy and, kind of just, kind of being kind of abrasive and whatnot. Pretty soon you would see that guy's wife and his son or sons, kind of having a response to that. They're either getting angry too, or they're withdrawing, or, doing whatever, but they've been impacted. Interestingly, parents had far less effect, in fact, little effect, on daughters. So when, this dad comes home, sure, it certainly affects, the sons and the mother, but less of an effect on daughters. Now, the strongest path, though, wasn't, from, dad coming home in a bad mood and it affecting the family. The strongest path was actually from daughters to parents, which is kind of interesting. So, if the daughter comes home, and she's has had a bad breakup or something like this, and is very depressed, and this will actually have a bigger effect on the family, on the parents, I should say, than vice versa, and actually more than in any other emotional contagion within families. So I'm not sure the reason for that, but I think it's pretty interesting. So we read about the 3 degrees of influence. One of the title of the first edition of this book is about, how your friends influence the ways that you think. And this plays out into happiness as well. First of all, because of homophily, which again, remember, is when people are basically, they tend to cluster among other people of other people who are similar to them, whether that's, the same race, the same religion, the same counterculture style, whatever it might be. People tend to cluster among those who are like them. So that also applies to people who are happy or unhappy. So we tend to find that happy people tend to cluster among each other. Unhappy people, probably because they don't want to, the happy people don't want to, deal with the unhappy people. We find that the unhappy people cluster among themselves. And usually, if you remember when we've, kind of looked at some of these social networks and, there's some examples in the book, you'll see some of those people there on the periphery that don't have as many lines connected to them. Those tend to be where unhappy people are located. They're not usually in the, in a dense cluster of network ties. Now, I thought this was pretty fascinating. So a person is 15% more likely to be happy if they are directly connected to a happy person. So 1 degree of connection. At 2 degrees, they're 10% more likely to be happy. At 3 degrees, 6%. And this is probably why you see a lot of happy friends essentially ditch their unhappy friends. So this research has found that each unhappy friend, each friend you have that may be depressed, decreases the likelihood of happiness by 7%. So there are some people who are, they're feeling good, they're happy, and then they've got this unhappy friend who's telling them about, their horrible day or their horrible life, or whatever it might be. And this happy person, they start to become less happy, and nobody likes to be happy. So what you end up seeing then is, kind of a break at a certain point. Where that happy person doesn't want to spend as much time with the other person because they don't want their unhappiness to rub off on them. So this is, it's fascinating research. I think it really shows the importance of social connections. So much so that social connections are more likely to bring about happiness than lots of money or a certain amount of money. So an extra $10,000 of income per year yields about a 2% increase in the chance of happiness. Now that's that's compared to the 15% chance that you get from a happy friend that you have. So you have some happy friend that you hang out with. That's going to actually bring you greater happiness than a raise of $10,000. You may be happy for that, a couple days, that you first get the raise, but then you've still got never-ending bills and debts, and life goes on and so on. But your happy close friend, they'll always be there to, hopefully you don't have to pay them bills and stuff like that. So they're likely to, increase your happiness. But also remember the third degree of freedom. So they potentially have a happy friend, and because of their happy friend, you have a 6 to 10% chance of becoming more happy. And that's through direct ties. You have never met this friend of your friend, but through this sort of emotional contagion, you're happier because they are happier. Very interesting. Now, so where does happiness come from? Well, that's a hard question to ask. Basically, happiness, cross-culturally is viewed the same. We see a lot of, similar, basically the same facial expression. A lot of these things are very similar. Well, we think that, long-term, general sort of happiness that people experience in life, a lot of it is genetic. Estimates are that it's about 50% is genetic. So, there are some people who suffer chronic depression, and where some of that is clearly genetic, where perhaps in their other aspects of their lives, they have a good family, good job, all of these things that would, suggest that you should be happy all the time. There may be something genetic there. You can often think of very successful artists and people who have nonetheless committed suicide. Obviously, they've been through a lot, but then there's some stuff that's pretty biologically ingrained. So then some of this, then 10% is circumstance, quality of life, and again, some of that can be influenced by genes and so on, and then 40% by attitude. So what do you think? So there's been a lot of research. You can't think your way into just total positivity or happiness, but you can kind of fool yourself into being more happy, to kind of ignore negative, or at least not ruminate on negative things as much. And so your attitude actually plays a big role. Now, of course, as I said, this is all very interconnected. So your attitude is also, influenced by genes and so on and so forth. But these is basically, the main things that make us feel happy or not. So we find loneliness as being this discrepancy between, a desire for a connection, but not having those actual connections. And basically, interestingly here, as it says, each extra friend that you have reduces the frequency of loneliness by a couple days per year. So the average, if you feel lonely sometimes, don't feel like you're alone. You're not alone in feeling lonely. The average person feels lonely roughly 50 days out of the year, and that's the average. So it ranges pretty more than that and lower than that. The thing about loneliness, we do know that it can have some negative effects on human health and so on. So anyway, that's just going through some of the information on the second chapter. The first one, I don't think that I need to go over it because it's spelled out pretty well in the book, and I think you can kind of see that. But I will upload the slides that go along with it, so you can go over that, just in case you have any, in case there's any confusion regarding, what exactly is a node, a tie, and all these things. So basically now I'm just going to briefly kind of discuss different types of research. So we call basic research the type of scientific research where you're not trying to apply it to anything, you're just trying to find out, just the very basics of something. So if you're, an astrobiologist or something, you're studying, samples that are coming back from Mars, to just see what the soil there is like. But you're not trying to, do research in order to come up with some new fertilizer or something like that. I've done a fair amount of research. I think, as I mentioned, I spent a long time studying ethnic cleansing and conflict, but I've also done research on urban development and things like that, which turned into a book which you should all buy, and buy copies for your friends and family and so on. Okay, so in the United States, American sociology was a little bit different than the sociology in Europe. If you remember, Marx, Weber, Durkheim were kind of focused on those big questions, big social processes. Macro level sociology is what we call it, where they are looking at systems like capitalism or democracy, feudalism, religion, all these huge social systems. At the University of Chicago in the late 1800s, and really taking off in the 1900s, you get an approach that's much different and is actually much closer to the social science of today. So University of Chicago was one of the first research institutions in the U.S. You probably not heard the term R1. R1 means top-notch research university. Penn State is an R1. But basically this model comes out of the University of Chicago. So the University of Chicago had the first sociology department, and rather than just doing kind of these broad historical studies and developing theories like they were doing in Europe, they did a more sort of data-based approach in the United States. They were looking at case studies, for example. They also used historical methods, looking at autobiographies, diaries. They traced a lot of letters, and they also started to use statistical methods that were already being used in economics, and then they started to apply them to sociology questions. And of course, you can also do what's called just participant observation, where you essentially just watch what's going on and take notes or video record. Now, the big challenge with any sort of research, whatever method you choose to do and whatever you're researching, is the fact that you're probably going to be covering or researching a small sample of a broader population. So say you were interested in male employment in Pennsylvania right now. You're not going to be able to, interview or survey every single male in Pennsylvania. So you send out, like 1,000 surveys to, some to Pittsburgh, some to Philly, and the rest to various smaller towns. Basically, what you want to get then is, a sample that's representative of the broader population. So that's why you would send out these surveys to both people in Philly and Pittsburgh, as well as all the rural towns and communities in between. If you were to just get them from Philly or just from rural areas, that would not be as representative of Pennsylvania as using an approach that tries to gather a representative sample. So one of the first things you have to figure out is quantitative versus qualitative research methods. So over on this side, we've got the quantitative methods, and then over here, we've got qualitative. So quantitative basically means numbers. It means statistical methods. Here you want large samples. You want to get, say you're doing that study on male employment in Pennsylvania. You're going to want, if you could get 1,500, that's better than 30. So you want to get, large samples that are representative. Here you can test theories. So someone may have a theory that men aren't, the men who are employed in Pennsylvania, most don't have a college degree. So that's what you're looking at. And then you could test that theory by, by having a survey there. And then you can also do things such as generalize, from your sample. You can also figure out things like causality. So you can figure out that, okay, maybe some of the men who are not who are unemployed don't have a high school diploma or something like that. They tend to be pretty reliable because statistics tend to be fairly reliable if used correctly. And it's very clear, what the numbers say. Qualitative research is a bit different. You can kind of think of quantitative and quantity, numbers, that sort of thing. Qualitative, like quality, meaning, high quality. That doesn't necessarily mean it's higher quality than a quantitative study, but rather that you can get deeper information. So one of the things that you would do in a qualitative study is interview people. But for that, you'll need small samples. So you can't say you're interested in, again, sticking with male employment and unemployment in Pennsylvania. So instead of trying to interview 1,500 people, which would take probably years and, take way too long to analyze and so on, you get a smaller sample. Maybe, you get like 50 people or something. Some from Philadelphia, some from Pittsburgh, and some from elsewhere. And then you can interview them. So you can ask them a lot of questions and open-ended questions that you can't do on a survey that you would send out to do a quantitative analysis. And then you develop a theory and say it's from this theory of interviewing people that you think, I think there's a relationship between education and employment. And then these things, reflexivity, transferability, credibility, and so on, all of these things are basically things that you need to think about as you're analyzing the data. It's very specific, and it tends to have a lot of context. So these workers, they could go into a lot of detail, about the work they do, about their schooling, that they might not be able to in a survey. Now, the best research is ones that use triangulation, where you use qualitative methods to kind of build up a theory, generate a theory, then you use quantitative methods to test it. So anyway, in a nutshell, that's what those are. Like I said, kind of like yin and yang, quantitative and qualitative research go best when paired. Another term that if you're in anthropology, you might be familiar with this. It's called ethnography. So this would be that participant observation, interviews, things like this. It's qualitative research, but it's where you kind of go out into the field, so to speak, where you go out and you interview these workers, or maybe you just go and observe a job site or something like that. So again, this generates richer, deeper data, but you can't generalize it very well. So you may get this, great stories from construction workers or something in Philadelphia, but it's a completely different, sort of situation out in some rural part of Pennsylvania. So you always have to be kind of careful about that. Maybe, you may be just kind of looking at something that's specific to this particular situation. As I said, anthropology is kind of interesting. It kind of comes out of colonialism, European colonialism, as a way to understand the subjects, their colonial subjects. Basically some of these methods were invented for colonial, administration. And then anthropology kind of branched out into its own scientific field. And then, I think of sociology as kind of like the anthropology of the industrial world. Okay, so as I said, we can use surveys. This gathers lots of data from a large number of people. Great for statistics. You can do random sampling. This is one of the best ways to do research on people and their attitudes. Problem is that people are now more than ever are just bombarded with surveys. So not everyone is filling them out. So surveys often get a pretty low response rate. The Pew Research Center, one of the top polling agencies in the United States, their response rate is usually about 7 to 9%. And then they use probability formulas to essentially, get out what the number would be. I mean, they're very skilled statisticians working on this stuff, but there is this growing awareness that people are not filling out surveys, and when they do, it's certain types of people that fill out surveys, that sort of thing. The new sort of area that everyone is trying to get into and figure out how to integrate with other social science methods is big data. So this would be examining data that's coming from social media, companies, maps, and so on. You have a lot of social and computer scientists that are in discussion, trying to figure out how they can learn from each other. If you go to the American Sociological Association annual meetings for the last 10, 15 years or so, there's been a growing social media presence. Companies are there. They want to learn, how social scientists are doing things, and maybe hire a few if they can. Big data presents a number of unique ethical issues in terms of how you're gathering the data. Most people don't really know where their online data exists, and so on. So this is, the issues that, social media companies face, researchers would also face, even more scrutiny, actually. Other things, experiments. We don't use experiments as often in sociology. In social psychology, we do, which is kind of that sort of in-between area between social and psych. But generally, the nice thing about experiments is you have kind of complete control of the conditions. You can, see what causes something. You can establish cause and effect very easily, that sort of thing. The reason that it's not used as much by sociologists is because there are a lot of instances where we know that sometimes what happens in a lab doesn't necessarily happen out in the so-called real world. So sociologists usually try to study what's going on out there in the real world, and then good sociologists will kind of, look and see if experimental research is finding kind of similar things, or if what they find is different. So there are basically 8 stages in the research process. I'll kind of go through them, kind of talk about using my dissertation, which became a book, the last big project that I was working on. So first of all, the first step is defining the research process. So you want to know, what are the gaps in our understanding about this topic? What are the puzzles that have not been solved yet? So I was interested in this thing called smart growth, where cities are trying to build at higher densities to save space. They're trying to put in, things like more bus stops, trains, that sort of thing. And so I was interested in the people who were developing these things. And I noticed that there was a clear gap in the research. There was not a lot of sociological research on developers in general. And certainly I think the first sociologist to look at smart growth developers specifically. The second stage is reviewing the evidence. Here you go to the library, or the library databases online, and you review all the research that's ever been done on this topic. Not quite, but pretty close. My dissertation had like 20 or 25 pages just in the bibliography, just of my work cited. So, but that's what you need to do. You need to look try and find at least the biggest studies, most influential studies that have been done, review them, look at, the way other researchers have addressed the problem. Then you start to make the problem more precise. So, I began to think, okay, well, are we going to find that smart growth developers, do they care more about the environment than other ones? Things like that. And you try and come up with something that is testable. So mine was actually what you would call, excuse me, it was kind of a very early analysis, in some ways descriptive research. So I wasn't trying to test a hypothesis, it was more building a hypothesis in that qualitative research way. So once you've kind of decided that, in my case, doing a qualitative study, try to figure out what's the best way to do that. So I decided to do a number of interviews with developers and people who work in cities, city management, mayors, that sort of thing. And then finally the fun part, which is carrying out the research itself. And this can be fun. For my research, I basically took a train up and down the West Coast and went to various cities and interviewed people, went to various building projects and took pictures and did some participant observation. You also have to deal with unanticipated problems. So I had a colleague who got a huge grant, like $1 million grant, to go do research in, I believe it was Liberia. And so she got over there, and was starting her research, and then a civil war broke out. This was some time ago, like 20 years ago or something. And so, she couldn't carry out her research, but she was still in Africa, still had all this research funding and so on. So I can't remember which country she went to. She went to a neighboring country where you still had a lot of the same ethnic groups, and a lot of the social dynamics were fairly similar enough that she didn't have to completely do a totally new research project. But that's definitely an unanticipated problem that she had to address. Usually they're not that dramatic. Usually it's something like, you're doing your research and the person you want to interview is sick or something like that. And then you get these results and you have to interpret them. So if you're doing a quantitative study, this means basically typing in a few numbers, pressing a few buttons, and letting the software do the analysis. And then you have to figure out, okay, then what does this mean? You go back to your initial research question, you sort of look at your hypotheses, and then you decide whether or not the research agrees or disagrees with what you have done. And then I say the next thing that you want to do is report the findings. That's either for research organization, a peer-reviewed article, or books. And then you repeat. And I say repeat because someone should at least repeat. Maybe not necessarily you, but someone needs to replicate. And that's the more scientific term for this. Replicate your research. So for example, I was looking at development in cities on the West Coast. So I might be able to say something about urban development on the West Coast of the United States, but I probably, it'd be quite a stretch for me to say that then this applies to cities on the East Coast or, the Deep South or something like this. You would need someone else to, first of all, go back and make sure that I did the research right, do the same sort of study on the West Coast. Say, okay, well, everything kind of checks out. So, why don't we try it over there on the East Coast? And then, maybe it'll be the same, maybe it would be different. But that's kind of the next step in where the research would go. Replication. This can be difficult sometimes in sociology, just due to the nature of society. Sometimes you can't. It's hard to do a perfect comparison. For example, the West Coast and the East Coast, They were developed at very different times. Most of the West Coast is developed, after the automobile has been invented. The opposite for the East Coast. And so you have cities that have just organically developed in very different ways. Nonetheless, you still need to do some replication if possible. Replication is very important in the medical sciences and in psychology, because there and here it's actually a crisis because you don't have enough replication happening. What that means is that, there'll be some big finding and that'll be counterintuitive, that, some scientists will find that, eating, peanuts will, make you able to lift more weight than you would be if you didn't, or something like that. And, this is an interesting finding, so, it gets an article about it in the New York Times and the Washington Post. But then a year later, someone replicates the research and finds that, there's a problem. Original researcher had chosen bodybuilders in their sample or too many or something like that. And when you do the research again, you don't get that finding. Someone else tries it. They don't get that finding either. So that, shows that the initial study was bunk, essentially. However, you usually don't get the newspapers coming back and saying, research finds that this study we reported on a year ago, was completely wrong. So unfortunately, we're in this situation now where the medical sciences really, really need to be, where every study really does need to be replicated. And that is that for methods. I do want to move on, start talking about culture for a little bit, and then kind of end a little bit early. So culture is, a huge sort of field in sociology. It's not the same as society. We generally think of society as people who are living in a territory that are governed by the same set of institutions. Oftentimes they have a common belief system. And for a long time, sociologists were primarily looking at things like economics and politics. And then in the 1960s and 70s, you get what's called the cultural turn in sociology, where sociologists start to look at things like culture, counterculture, and things like this. So there are some things that we know are universal, and I'll kind of go through some of these. Let's see. Sorry. Okay, so one of them is having a grammatically complex language. This, for a long time, it was believed that our ability to make sentences and so on is the result of behavioral psychology. Basically, I think I may have mentioned B.F. Skinner earlier, but basically reward and punishment, that we're just kind of, it's that sort of system. And that's how we learn language. In the late 1950s, the linguist Noam Chomsky basically blew that theory out of the water and argued that we have a universal capacity, probably biological, for generating complex language. And he pointed out that, kids can say sentences that they've never heard before, and can construct sentences and so on, in ways that seem novel. And there's no way that this could happen in that sort of behaviorist view of psychology. So there's something innate within us that's biological. Other aspects of cultural universals, family systems, marriage, we see these in every society. The contours differ. Sometimes throughout most of human history, family systems were marriages were to bring families together. They were usually for political reasons, especially for the more powerful. There's the incest prohibition, which is a cultural and a biological universal. There's kind of an interesting experiment that the social psychologist Jonathan Haidt uses. I used this back in the old days when we would be in the classroom and would use a clicker to poll people on this, basically. So Haidt sets up this scenario where there's an adult brother and sister. They're like in their late 20s or something. They're having a vacation on this desert island, and they decide they want to have sex with each other. And they decide that, like, he's had a hysterectomy but is going to wear a condom. She's on the pill. There's no way, basically, there's going to be any offspring as a result of this. It strengthens their relationship, and they go on with the rest of their lives. So Jonathan Haidt, he tells this story, and then he polls the class on, so, okay, how many of you think that this is wrong, that, them having sex is wrong? And I've polled the class, and it's always like 95% who think it's wrong. Interesting 5%. Interestingly, about 5% always are okay with it. But okay, so then we ask the reasons. Okay, so why are you opposed to it? And usually the first thing will be, well, if there's a baby, it's going to have deformities and so on. And I have to say, remember, that's controlled for. They're not. It's had a hysterectomy and. And they're using protection, etc., etc. There's no chance that's going to happen. Someone will usually say something along those lines again, and someone will say, like, well, it could, cause problems for the family. And I'm like, oh yeah, but remember, in this story, that's controlled for too, that it's, they actually become closer and so on. And basically, the point is not that, that incest is fine. The point is that the way that we usually construct arguments based off of rational choice theory, based on those sort of sets of logic, there shouldn't be anything wrong with this. We shouldn't feel anything wrong with this if rational choice theory is real, if it works. But it doesn't, and this is a good example of why. You can have all these logical reasons why this should be okay, but deep inside of you, there's something that's saying, no, this, brothers and sisters can't have sex with each other. This is wrong. So what is that? That's biology. That's some very powerful biology there that's trying to prohibit that. So anyway, I just wanted to go through that example there. Other things that we see across cultures, different types of art, dancing, body adornment such as tattoos. I've actually got a tattoo that is one of the oldest discovered in the world. It's the oldest, good intact tattoo. It's from a Princess Yukok in Siberia from about 2,500 years ago. They don't know if she was actually a princess or a shaman or something like this. She actually had a lot of tattoos. Her body was covered in tattoos, and I got one of those as my design. So yeah, people have been doing tattooing and making art and coming up with music for a very, very long time. All societies have examples of games. There's gift giving, and that'll become important more on Thursday's lecture. We hear people telling jokes and so on. Every society and culture has rules of hygiene. They may differ, but there's, according to, the wealth of a society, its resources, all that sort of thing. But every society has some set of guidelines regarding basic hygiene. So as I said, that incest story and the biology there really goes against this idea of rational choice theory. Rational choice theory was kind of the dominant way in which social scientists, sociologists, political scientists, economists, and so on, how they studied human behavior. Basically, the core of the idea is that human beings are rational, that we base our behavior on rational calculations. We usually think of optimizing our pleasure or profit when we make decisions. And rational choice theory presumes that the individual decision-making unit is basically representative of broader society. So, if you're an economist, how an individual, buys or sells things is typical of the broader buyers and sellers in the market. But do we constantly calculate our optimization or of pleasure or profit? So you've got this guy and woman here. They've emptied a few bottles of wine, and, he's thinking, if I were to kiss you, then there's this 17% probability that we might get married, and that has a 24% chance of divorce, and chance of children, etc., etc. He's like, I'm not sure if I can risk it according to my calculations. And she is saying, oh, please make him stop, and, etc. But the reality here is that, there are a lot of times where we do not actually calculate what's best for us, and that a lot of this is rooted deeply within us. I said language, for example. Noam Chomsky basically has argued that we have this universal grammar, this deep structure of grammatical rules. That's why you can take a baby that's born in Pennsylvania, drop that baby off to a family in Bolivia, and they will be speaking Spanish. They will grow up speaking Spanish, that sort of thing. For a while in the 1970s and 80s, you had this field called semiotics, which was the study of linguistic and non-linguistic phenomena, such as signals that can generate meaning. And it kind of started to, I wouldn't say die out, but it wasn't quite weren't as many researchers doing it. But now it's starting to make a comeback with emojis and, all of these different ways you can communicate with each other. Interestingly, the Facebook emojis, they were developed in part with some help by Dr. Keltner, who's a fantastic social psychologist at Berkeley. Anyway. He helped with some of this, and he helped with the movie Inside Out, if you're familiar with that, about inside person's brain, that sort of thing. Anyway, other things regarding language. There's something called the linguistic relativity hypothesis, or the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. I would remember both of those for the exam. Sapir and Whorf are the two scientists who discovered it. Basically, what they say is that what we perceive is limited by the language which we use to think and speak. With the conclusion then being that different languages lead to different patterns of thought. My understanding right now is that a lot of linguists disagree with this for the most part, although there is some truth to it in the sense that we think perhaps differently and we interpret things differently, rather than being limited. We just have a difference in perception. And so let's see, I'll run through these societies rather quickly. Kind of the first oldest group behavior groups that we saw were hunting-gathering societies. There are less than 250,000 worldwide today. Most of them exist in the Amazon. Some of them have actually been coming out now because of COVID. COVID has reached some of these small tribes deep in the jungle, and they often come out, and come out to modern society looking for medical treatments. Usually small groups, very small, 30, 50 people at the most. Not a lot of material possessions. A lot of egalitarianism, cooperation. The elders in the tribe tend to be the rulers. And I have a family in Papua New Guinea. I have a cousin who married into a Papua New Guinean tribe, and her husband was on the national rugby team in Papua New Guinea. But so in Papua New Guinea, a lot of these tribes will live in these valleys here. And a lot of them, have been so isolated that, they won't even know of another group a few valleys down, a few valleys away. But so also they were, they're fans of rugby, which is a British sport. And so my cousin's husband, who was a national player, he wasn't allowed to play in the sort of village matches because, when two villages would play each other, because he was so good, it'd be like, having Michael Jordan on your basketball team in your neighborhood or something like that, a bit of a disadvantage to the other team. But for whatever reason, he was able to play because there were like two sick people on his village's team or whatever. And the other village was, okay with that. They still weren't happy about it. But he told my cousin not to come because, they hadn't seen very many white people or people from the outside world, and it probably wouldn't make him too happy. And she ignored him and came anyway, and already there were fights breaking out because the guy with the team with the national rugby player was doing much better, and then his white wife comes, and that just leads to more and more of a brawl, and there were concussions and broken bones and whatnot. The next day, the two groups come together, and they pay each other in blood wealth, what's called blood wealth. This is something that exists in tribal societies where there will be a tribal conflict, and what will then happen is that, a certain number of people will be injured, a couple even killed, and they will pay the other tribe, the other group, with, extra cattle or crops or something like this. And that was how a lot of conflicts were managed. A lot of tribal conflicts across the world were managed. And in my studies of conflict in East Africa, I saw that this was very common there as well. And I also noticed how it broke down. And this I think, is an understudied subject. But one of the reasons it broke down is the machine gun. So, before that, with machetes and spears or even like a musket, it would take a while. You're not going to kill a lot of people with these weapons, and so on. However, a machine gun, you can, kill, 20 people in just a matter of minutes. And so these systems, these legal systems, just broke down because they were not set up to accommodate that, that high level of death and impairment. So what did the other tribe do? Often was the case, well, they got guns themselves. And that gives us a lot of the conflict we see in the world today. Again, a subject that has not been given enough attention. So a lot of these tribes then moving from hunting-gatherer tribes to pastoral and agrarian societies. So pastoral would be tribes that would herd cattle, the nomadic Lakota Sioux in North America, the Plains Indians that would follow the buffalo, that sort of thing. They would also, in Africa, for example, a lot of pastoral tribes would herd cattle as well as camels, things like that. And then there would be agrarian groups that would be agricultural. So they would grow crops. And they would often trade with the pastoral groups. Sometimes there would be conflict between them. I've done a lot of research looking at conflict amongst and between these groups. So over time, though, agrarian societies, you start to get a surplus. And a surplus means you can start to trade or things like that. And you start to get more inequality, more competition, and you start to get more concentration of power, leading to these traditional societies, most of which disappeared in the 1800s. These are the feudal societies, the straight feudal societies where you had basically the nobility and then the serfs and so on. again, we kind of talked about this, I believe, in the last lecture, but you get the Industrial Revolution, and you get the growing power of the merchant class and so on, and the nobility becomes less powerful. Let's see. Okay. So you also have colonialism, and colonialism of the last 500 years has primarily referred to Europeans colonizing other parts of the world. Also Japan colonizing parts of Asia. So many nations today just became independent after the end of the Second World War, when places like France and Great Britain were in ruins themselves and couldn't maintain a colonial empire. They're also being pushed by the U.S. And elsewhere to let go of their colonies. We tend to see pretty high levels of poverty in some of these poorer countries. And the poverty had been dropping. I mean, it was kind of phenomenal. We've seen huge drops in poverty, so that for the first time in human history, for about 5 or 10 years, the percentage of people living in absolute poverty, deep, life or death poverty, was under 10%, in the single digits for the first time in human history. That was a couple of years ago, and I remember telling students that, and talking how great of an achievement was. And that was before COVID. Now, I'm not sure what those levels are, but they're much higher. We're back in the double digits, not in the single digits in terms of absolute poverty anymore. So we know that industrialization comes along. It kind of destroys these other older forms of society. You start to need power. People are moving off the farms or being forced off into urban areas. And with that, you get people wanting a greater say in their lives, so you get more and more developed political systems. And you also get with that the spread of diseases. And I think I'll stop here for today, and we'll continue here talking about pandemics and how their role in society. Really interesting stuff. I think you'll find it very fascinating. So on Thursday, I'll continue talking about culture, and I'll also start talking about the environment and population, so that we're on track for the exam next week. All right, have a good week, everyone.